Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the Motorcity Mechanic. On today's video, we're continuing with our 5-part video series on removing and replacing the oil pump on a 3.2 and 3.6 liter Pentastar engine in Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram front-wheel drive vehicles. Now, last episode, I worked on showing you everything on the vehicle, and then we moved over to the engine on the stand, and we dealt with removing that lower stamp steel pan. Now in part 2, we're dealing with removing the upper aluminum pan, and then at that point we're going to start dealing with the oil pump. We're going to remove some items related to that. So for now, let's go ahead and get started. Now, with that stamped steel pan out of the way, I can point out a couple important things here. Number one, question might come up, why don't we just unbolt the aluminum oil pan, leave the stamped steel in place, and lift it up as one piece? Well, the issue you have is that the bolts around the perimeter of the aluminum oil pan, not all of them are on the outside. Some of them, such as here, here, and here, and along the front, are inside. So that stamped steel pan has to come off in order to get to those. And then of course the other question is, with that stamped steel pan out of the way, it looks like we've got a lot of access to everything related to the oil pump. Well, there's two things that are really out of the way that you can't get to. And those of course are fasteners that hold the pump in place. If you look right here, we've got a total of two 10mm bolts that attach the pump on this side to the block. On the opposite side, we've got two more as well. The issue is getting access to those, because the general location where they are is right in this location but straight down. Of course, that aluminum upper oil pan is blocking that. Now this is the step-by-step method. We're going to move on to actually taking this aluminum upper piece off. Now the shortcut video is going to show some other things. Now I've got to have some tricks up my sleeve, right? Got to have some things to save time. Now we'll go more into that in that series. But for now, we're going to work on actually taking this aluminum piece off here. I want to go ahead and point out also some key features related to that pump. Now the pump itself is chain driven. Now we've got a metal plate over the front that's covering it, and it's held in place with two 8mm bolts. It's got a spring-loaded tensioner, and the chain itself isn't timed in any manner. It's just slid on. Now there's a keyway for the gear going to the pump, but otherwise there's no issues of having to worry about timing that chain. Now, as you saw before, we've got a couple fasteners around here, and we've got a couple fasteners back up in there. And we're also going to talk about the electronic solenoid and also the pickup tube. From this angle, you can see the oil pickup tube with its mesh screen. The tube leads to the back of the oil pump where there's an O-ring that prevents any kind of leakage there. We've got a 10mm bolt for the flange that attaches it to the pump. Next to that, we've got a solenoid, and it's this electronic solenoid that gives us precise control of the output from this pump. Now we've got mechanical relief valves built into this, so if the pressure gets too high, it bleeds off back into the oil pan. But this solenoid can actually vary the chambers inside the pump, affecting both the pressure and the flow. And mainly we do that for variable valve timing, because we can change the position of the cam sprocket on the camshaft by oil pressure, and that's how we do it. Now this solenoid has a harness that goes through the side of the block, and it has a connector on the outside. So now we're ready to start working on removing all the bolts that attach the aluminum pan to the engine block. We've taken that section of exhaust out right here, so we don't have to worry about anything crossing over the pan that's going to prevent us from lifting it straight off once we get the seal broke loose. And the bolts that are around the perimeter, we've got a series of 13mm, and then we've also got two 10mm that are somewhat hidden. I'm going to show you where those are, and we're going to point out some of the other bolts as well. Now, if the engine still had the transaxle bolted to it, you would see that there are a total of 5 15mm bolts along the bottom. Not only are there 5 bolts, but there are 2 rubber plugs right here where there's 2 10mm bolts deep down inside. And that's where the oil pan actually bolts to the retainer plate for the rear main seal. And if you don't take those off and you try to separate the pan, you're going to damage the rear main seal, and then you have to remove the transaxle. Also, you can remove this inspection cover, same cover that you take off when you need to access the torque converter bolts. Once you pop that off, you can see the 2 10mm bolts. And looking at it closely, you can see that one of the 10mm is right there, and then the other one's located right there. And it's in both of these locations that we're going to insert a long extension 10mm socket to get all the way down in there. Now, being that the engine's overhead in the vehicle, we don't have to use a magnet. It's just going to come out with the socket. But nonetheless, you can put a magnet through the side if you need to, especially if you've got this on a stand like I do. I'm going to use a magnet, that way I don't lose the bolts. So go ahead and get up in there. Okay, there we go. We got one. And we've got two. Before we go taking the upper aluminum oil pan bolts off, what we're going to do is we're going to look around the perimeter of the oil pan itself and see if there's anything bolted in place that we're going to have to take off that might be attached to it. For example, on this particular engine, we've got a coolant hose right here with a bracket. There's a 13mm bolt up under here. That's the only thing on this engine that's bolted in place, so we will be removing that. The other thing to take into consideration is the old dipstick tube. It bolts further up onto the cylinder head and has an O-ring where it goes through the aluminum upper housing of the oil pan. So just go ahead and grab your 13mm socket and take this bolt off. Now that we've got that coolant hose pipe unbolted from the upper pan, we need to work on removing the old dipstick tube. Now, if you look at the top right here where the dipstick goes through, if you follow it down, probably about 6 inches down, there's a 13mm bolt. That's what we need to back off. At that point, we're going to try to wiggle the tube loose. Now, one thing you need to pay attention is we've got the alternator directly below, and right here is where the positive cable from the battery goes to that alternator. So it's in line with that 13mm bolt. So what I recommend doing, so that you don't have any issues with anything arcing or shorting out, is go ahead and disconnect that negative battery cable so we don't have any problems. So go ahead and remove the dipstick itself. That way we don't have to worry about breaking the handle off while we're trying to wiggle everything. And then get you something that can reach down in here. Now, you're going to be limited on space. You may be able to use a ratcheting 13mm wrench. You may be able to get up in there with a cordless ratchet. Whatever works best for you. Back it all the way off and try not to lose the bolt. Now go ahead and grab that dipstick tube and try wiggling it and rotating it at the same time to see if you can get it broke loose. If you can, great. Go ahead and pull it up, lift it out of the hole that it's in, set it to the side. But what happens if you can't remove the tube? You've been wiggling it, you've been pulling on it, and nothing has happened. Don't have any worries. I don't want you to squeeze on this to try to pull it up with some pliers. There's another technique you can use to actually knock this through the pan, and I'll show you in just a little bit. Now, the method that I use when I run across one of these stuck old dipstick tubes is I find me a socket that's about the same diameter as the tube, yet small enough to go through the pan as I'm knocking it through. For example, I've got an 8mm socket right here. It's 1/4 inch drive. I went ahead and grabbed me an extension, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a mallet and I'm going to tap on the end of the extension and hopefully drive that dipstick through the upper pan. Just take your time, give it some good hits until it comes all the way out the other side. Now remember, the whole reason why we took that stamp steel pan off is we've got some bolts on the inside that actually attach the pan to the block. We've got some along the front here and on this edge as well. And depending on the vehicle you're working on, the number of them may be different. This is a 200 and we've got a total of 7 bolts. They're all 13mm that we've got to take loose. So that's what we're doing next. So it doesn't matter where you start, just get you a socket and start backing them off. And now we can continue with taking the bolts off around the outside. And then working your way around, get to the last remaining bolts. Now all the bolts have been taken off around the perimeter of the aluminum pan, and we're about ready to pry it loose. But when you go back and you think how we took that stamp steel pan off, we left 2 nuts in place. And the whole reason for that was when we broke the RTV loose from the pan, we didn't have to worry about the pan falling and making a mess. So we need to step back and do the exact same thing on the aluminum pan. So we're going to grab 2 of those 13mm bolts that we took off, and we're going to strategically locate them, 1 on each side of the block, so that when we do break the pan loose from the block, it doesn't just fall. That way they get caught by something, and then we can go back those off, and then remove the pan. So starting on either side of the oil pan, just find you a spot that's easy to get to. Insert one of those 13mm bolts we took out, and thread it in a few turns, and then do the same thing on the opposite side. Now, to aid in separating that aluminum pan from the block, there are some notches that are strategically placed around the engine where you can actually put pry bars in or whatever you need to get up in there to try to wedge and separate it. Here's one right here. There's another located right here, which isn't too far from where that electrical connector is on the oil pump. And on the opposite side of the block, we've got one located here. And last but not least, we've got one located right there, which is only a couple inches away from that 13mm bolt that we took off that was holding that coolant line attached to the aluminum pan. Now find whichever one of those 4 notches that you can get to easily, and go ahead and grab your pry bar and insert it. Now use some prying motion, take your time. Like I said, this stuff is held on very well. Just keep prying and try not to break nothing. You can see it's starting to flex a little. Just keep lifting up. And if you can, you might want to relocate to another one of the slots so you can get the rest of the seal broke loose. And just repeat the same procedure at a different location. And just keep working at it until you finally get the pan broke loose. Now that we've pried the upper pan loose from the block, we're ready to go ahead and remove it. But remember, earlier I had you thread 2 of the 13mm bolts in, so that way when we broke it loose, the pan didn't fall on top of us. We've got to go ahead and remove both of those bolts. So as we're taking both of these 13mm bolts off, what you need to do is use one hand to support the pan, because there's not going to be anything else holding it to the block at that point. So back it off, apply some pressure with this hand. And then you're ready to grab the pan and lift up. Now with that upper pan off, we've now got access to everything that's related to the oil pump. So what we're going to do is we're going to start one by one, removing everything that's necessary until we finally get it off the engine. The oil pump is actually attached to the block with a total of 4 10mm bolts. We've got 2 over here and then 2 over here. Pickup tube is bolted to the back of the pump with a 10mm as well. Now you can opt to either take the pickup tube off now while it's still on the block, or you can remove it after the fact once we remove the entire oil pump assembly. Now there are going to be certain situations where you need to replace the pickup tube. Now for example, we had a check engine light, we replaced the oil pump because of the P06DD code. Now for that instance, the pickup tube can be reused. There was no failure as far as with the engine, no sludge built up. We can reuse this as long as we replace the O-ring. Now if there is sludge built up or there was a failure of some sort in the engine, maybe you broke a rod, something to that effect, and you found metal in the pan, you need to replace the pickup tube. That protective cover is attached to the oil pump using 2 8mm bolts. So now we can grab that T45, 3/8 ratchet, and go ahead and break the bolt loose for the gear on that oil pump. And we're not going to take it all the way off, we're just going to back it off a few turns. And now we're going to work with releasing the tension on the chain. Now the tensioner for the chain on that oil pump actually has a hole in it. Also there is a hole on the body of the oil pump. Now when we pivot this further back over, we can line those 2 holes up and insert something into the hole to keep it in place. Now I'm going to show you some different tools that you can use just for that. So what I've got laid down in front of us is a different assortment of tools that we can use for holding that tensioner out of the way. Now the three on the right are tensioner pins that I've accumulated over the years. They came with new tensioners. Once I installed them, pulled them out, released the tension, I kept them in my toolbox for a later date. So I still use them from time to time. We've got some with small shafts for smaller holes, larger shafts for larger holes, and we've got some that got an offset to get in tighter areas. Now more than likely you don't have any of these, but one thing you probably do have is a basic set of Allen wrenches. Now the one I'm going to be using is a 3.5 millimeter. Now it doesn't have to be metric, it can be standard, but more than likely I can't use nothing larger than that because of the size of the hole on that guide slash tensioner and the hole on the oil pump. So that's what we're going to be using. One perfect thing about this is the angle on it. It's not real long right here, so that short section of the Allen wrench is going to allow me to get in some tighter areas. So up to this point, we've got that upper aluminum section taken loose and we're dealing with the oil pump assembly. Now in part 3 that's coming up, we're going to work on removing the oil pump. We're going to put it on the workbench. We're going to point out some important things about it, and then we're going to prep the new oil pump and get it ready to be installed as well. So if you like this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up on YouTube. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you got any comments or suggestions about anything you saw in part 2 of this series, please make sure to email me at david@motorcitymechanic.com. If you like to shop on Amazon, please feel free to use the link that's in the description below this video, and anything that you buy will help support this channel. Once again everybody, thanks for watching and get ready for part 3.